I can't afford this date.
There were easier ways to ruin a first date. Maren Bellamy had considered most of them on the drive over, saying the wrong thing, laughing too loud, letting silence stretch too long. She hadn't considered this one. But here she was, sitting across from a man she'd spent 3 weeks working up the courage to meet, inside a restaurant where the cheapest entree cost $42, holding a leather-bound menu like it was a warrant for her arrest.
Nolan Greer looked exactly like his photos. Steady, unhurried, the kind of man who didn't fidget. She fidgeted.
"Can I say something before we order?" she asked. He nodded once. "I have $28 on me." She said it flat, no softening. "I just paid rent. I lost a shift. I should have picked somewhere else, but I didn't. And I'm not going to sit here and pretend I can split a $40 steak." She looked up. "I'm sorry. That's where we are." The table between them felt very wide. Nolan didn't reach for his wallet, didn't flinch, didn't smile in the way that meant pity. He just said, "I know a better place anyway." If you're the kind of person who believes that how someone treats you in a quiet, unscripted moment says everything you're going to want, to stay for this one. Subscribe if you haven't yet. Stories like this are why this channel exists. The food truck was parked where it always was, tucked against the iron railing at the edge of the waterfront, close enough to the lake that you could smell Champlain in the air if the wind came from the right direction. A hand-painted sign read, "Nora's Toast Wagon," in uneven yellow letters, and a strand of Edison bulbs ran along the awning, more warm than bright. The kind of light that made everything underneath it look like it mattered. Maren stood on the sidewalk and looked at it. She didn't know what she had expected. An apology maybe? A redirect to somewhere still moderately expensive. Not this. Not folding chairs and a chalkboard menu and a woman behind the window counter who called out the usual the moment Nolan got within 20 feet of the truck. "The usual," he confirmed. Then he glanced back at Maren. Too. Nora Keene had the kind of face that had stopped trying to look younger than it was, and was better for it. Sharp eyes, flower on her sleeve, the easy efficiency of someone who had worked a small space for a long time. She sized Maren up in a single look, and apparently decided she was acceptable, because she said, "Sit wherever," and turned back to her griddle without ceremony. They sat at a table near the railing, plastic chairs, a candle in a mason jar, the lake going dark and flat beyond the railing. Nolan had taken off his jacket somewhere between the gilded hearth and here, and without it, he looked less like a man performing the idea of a first date and more like himself, whatever that was. Maren was still learning the shape of it. "You come here a lot?" she said. It wasn't a question. "Friday nights mostly." He rested his forearms on the table. "My daughter calls it the good dinner, as opposed to the regular dinner, which is whatever I manage to put together after work." "How old is she?" 6. Something in his face shifted when he said it. Not softer exactly, but more present. "Her name's Tessa. She's—" He made a small sound that wasn't quite a laugh. "She has a lot of opinions about clouds." "Clouds." "She categorizes them. She has a whole system." He shook his head. "I can't explain it. You'd have to hear it from her." Maren smiled at the table. She couldn't help it. Nora slid 2 plates through the window without announcing them. Thick slices of sourdough, deeply golden, the cheese still pulling in strings. A paper cup of tomato soup on each tray. Maren wrapped both hands around the soup and felt the cold go out of her fingers. She hadn't realized she'd been cold. "Can I ask you something?" Nolan said. "Sure." "Back there." He nodded vaguely in the direction they'd come from. "Why did you say anything? You could have just—" He considered his words. "Ordered something cheap, offered to split it. Most people would have." Maren looked at the soup. "I didn't want to spend the whole night managing it." "Managing what?" "The gap." She set the cup down.
between what the situation was and what I was pretending it was. It takes a lot of energy, and I didn't. She stopped, started again differently. I wanted to actually be here, not perform being here. Nolan was quiet for a moment, not the silence of someone who didn't know what to say, but the kind that meant he was actually thinking about it. That's fair, he finally said. It was such a plain response. No reassurance, no deflection, no pivot to something easier, just, that's fair. Maren found it unexpectedly steadying. They ate. The night came in off the water, and the Edison bulbs held their small territory of warmth. And somewhere in the middle of it, Nolan told her about the community center job, an old building 2 neighborhoods over, city contract, mostly structural work, the kind of project that paid steadily enough to justify taking on a full crew for the winter. He talked about it the way people talk about work they actually respect, not bragging, not complaining, just describing something real. Maren listened and did not mention Laurel and Rook. She did not mention the quarterly board review she had sat through that morning, or the 40-minute call with investors, or the fact that her assistant Brenna had rescheduled 3 meetings so she could leave the office by 6. She set all of it down deliberately, the way you'd set a heavy bag on the floor of someone else's home, and hope they didn't notice the weight of it. She told him she worked in design. It was true enough. He didn't press. She told Brenna about it the next morning, standing in the kitchen of her apartment with her coat still half on. The kind of morning where you forget to take it off because something else has already occupied the part of your mind that manages small tasks. Brenna sat at the kitchen island with her laptop open and her coffee going cold, and listened to the whole thing with the careful expression of someone choosing their words. "He sounds decent," she said when Maren had finished. "He is." Brenna looked at her over the rim of her mug. "So, when are you going to tell him?" "Tell him what?" "Maren." Brenna set the mug down. They had worked together for 4 years, and in that time, Brenna had learned exactly when to push and when to let a thing sit. This was not a sitting moment, and they both knew it. "You made a profile with a fake job title and no company name. That's fine for a first conversation, but you're already talking about his daughter." "He brought up his daughter. I didn't." "That's not the point, and you know it." "I know." Maren said it before Brenna could continue, because she did know, and knowing didn't make it simpler. "I just need a little more time to see if it's real before you introduce the part of yourself that makes it complicated." "Yes." Brenna looked at her laptop screen, then back at Maren. "Okay," she said. Not agreement, just acknowledgement. The kind of okay that meant, "I'll drop it for now, but don't mistake that for approval." Nolan's house was a narrow 2-story on a street where the maples had gone fully orange and nobody had raked yet. The kind of neighborhood where people left bicycles unchained on their porches and waved at each other across yards. He had bought it 6 years ago, when the area was still priced for people who worked with their hands. And he had spent most of the years since fixing what the previous owners had neglected. Not out of any grand renovation plan, but because he knew how. And because things that were broken bothered him. Audrey had picked the paint color for the kitchen. Pale yellow, she'd called it, though it read closer to cream in winter light. He hadn't changed it. He wasn't sure he would. He wasn't sure about a lot of things in the months after the accident. What to do with mornings. How to explain absence to a 3-year-old without using words she wasn't ready for. How to keep going at the pace that life expected, when the part of him that had known how to do that was also gone. He had kept going anyway because Tessa needed breakfast, and the pipes needed fixing, and the work didn't stop wanting to be done. Grief, he had learned, was not incompatible with function. It just changed the quality of things, muted them, flattened them out, until even good days had a kind of texture like old cardboard. Not terrible, just nothing like before. The first time he laughed, really laughed, helpless and surprised, was 8 months after the funeral, when Tessa announced at dinner that macaroni was a type of cloud.
and argued her case with total conviction for 11 minutes. He had thought that night, okay, still possible. He had not since then let himself think much beyond that. Possible was enough. Possible was what he had. He asked Maren to meet him at the house the following Saturday, without entirely meaning to. He'd been planning to suggest the waterfront again, but Tessa had a cold, and he couldn't leave her with a neighbor. And he said it before he'd finished deciding whether it was a good idea. Maren arrived with orange juice, the kind in a glass bottle, which Tessa immediately identified as the fancy kind and approved of, and stood in the doorway of Nolan's living room, looking at the mismatched furniture and the shelves of children's books and the crayon drawing taped to the refrigerator, and something in her expression went very still. Not disappointed, something closer to the opposite. Tessa, stationed on the couch under a fleece blanket with a box of tissues and the air of someone milking a minor illness for everything it was worth, examined Maren from a distance of 6 feet with the frank assessment of a 6-year-old who had not yet learned to disguise her opinions. "Do you know how to braid?" she asked. "No," Maren admitted. Tessa considered this. "My dad doesn't either. He does ponytails." "Ponytails are good." "They're okay." She pulled the blanket tighter. "You can sit in the good chair if you want." Nolan from the kitchen doorway caught Maren's eye. She was trying not to smile. She sat in the good chair. Later, after Tessa had fallen asleep and Nolan had carried her upstairs and come back down to find Maren standing at the kitchen window looking out at the yard, they stood together for a while without talking. The backyard had an old bench in it, one of the legs replaced with a slightly different wood, the repair obvious but solid. "Did you fix that?" Maren asked. "Built it, actually, years ago." He looked at it through the glass. "The original leg cracked last winter. I didn't want to replace the whole thing, so—" She nodded slowly, as if she understood something about that beyond the bench itself. He thought, standing there, that she probably did. And somewhere in the back of his mind, the quiet part that had been carefully managing the distance between himself and things that could go wrong, a door opened just slightly, not all the way, but enough to let something in. He told himself it was just a good evening. He told himself that for 2 more weeks. The weeks that followed had a rhythm to them that Nolan hadn't planned for and didn't know how to name. Maren came back the next Saturday, and the one after that. Not because anyone had formally arranged it. It had simply become the shape of things, the way certain habits form, not from decision, but from repetition that turns out to feel necessary. She brought coffee the second time. The third time, she showed up with a bag of groceries and an expression of extreme concentration, and announced that she was going to learn to make tomato soup from scratch, because she was tired of being the only person in the world who bought it from a can. The soup was thin and slightly under-seasoned. Tessa ate 2 bowls and declared it excellent, which was either generous or the cold had affected her taste, and Maren sat at the kitchen table, looking at her empty bowl like it had told her something surprising about herself. Nolan said nothing. He washed the pot and let her have the moment. They walked the waterfront on Sunday afternoons when the weather held, which in Burlington in October meant you dressed for cold and hoped for mild. The lake had that late-season flatness to it, steel gray, and still the Adirondacks across the water dark against a low sky. They didn't always talk. Sometimes Tessa walked between them, holding both their hands and narrating the clouds with the focused energy of someone delivering a documentary. That one's a shelf cloud. That's a cumulus. That one doesn't have a name yet, so I'm calling it a blurred mountain. And Nolan would nod seriously. And Maren would ask follow-up questions with a sincerity that was not performed. That part mattered to him, though he didn't say so. The sincerity. Inside the small rented workshop on the edge of the South End, where he kept his tools and took on smaller custom pieces between the larger contracts, Nolan was building a set of chairs for the community center. Solid oak joinery fit tight enough to last 30 years, with reasonable care. He worked in the evenings after Tessa was in bed, the radio on low, the space smelling of sawdust and linseed oil.
And sometimes he would stop between cuts and find himself looking at the middle distance, thinking about nothing in particular, and realize that the particular nothing he was thinking about had a shape, had dark hair and an uneven smile, and wore the same slightly too large green canvas jacket on every walk they took together, as if she had chosen it carefully to look like she hadn't. He noticed things about her. He couldn't stop. She didn't talk about money, not in the way someone who was struggling usually didn't, not with the careful avoidance, or the topic changes, or the slight flinch when a bill arrived. She just didn't bring it up, the way you don't bring up something that isn't in the room. He thought in those weeks that she was someone who had simply decided not to let finances define her conversation. He respected that. He understood it. He was wrong about what it meant. It was Brenna who kept quiet, and Brenna who couldn't keep quiet much longer. She saw it happening in the margins of Maren's schedule, the early departures, the rearranged calls, the Friday afternoons that were suddenly unavailable, in a calendar that had previously had no Friday afternoons. She saw it in Maren's face in Monday morning meetings, a quality of distraction that wasn't tiredness, which Brenna knew how to read, but something more like a person carrying an interior argument they hadn't resolved yet. One evening, after a board prep session had run long and everyone else had cleared out, Brenna sat across from Maren in the conference room and said what she had been building toward for 2 weeks. "You're not testing him anymore." Maren looked up from the papers in front of her. "You were at first," Brenna continued. "That was the premise. Create a simple profile, see how someone treats you without the company name attached. Fine, but that's not what's happening now." She set her pen down. "You like him, and he thinks he knows who you are, and he doesn't. Those two things are going to collide, and you know it, and you're running out of time to be the one who decides how." The conference room was quiet in the way that large, empty rooms are quiet, a kind of amplified stillness. "I know," Maren said. "Then, I know Brenna." Her voice was not sharp, just tired. "I just don't know how to do it without it becoming the thing I was trying to avoid in the first place. The moment I say it, everything we've had gets reframed. He'll look back at every conversation and wonder which parts were real." Brenna looked at her steadily. All the parts were real. "He won't know that." "No," Brenna agreed. "He won't. Not right away." She picked up her pen again, capped it, set it down differently. "But the longer you wait, the less that defense holds up. Right now, you made a mistake. Later, you made a choice." Maren didn't answer. She gathered the papers in front of her into a stack and straightened them against the table. Not because they needed straightening, but because her hands needed something to do. Brenna let it sit. She had said the thing. She could not say it for her. The hardware store where Nolan bought materials for the community center job was a wide, low-ceilinged place on Pine Street that smelled of metal and rubber, and had the kind of staff who knew where everything was without looking. He went on a Thursday afternoon between a site check and picking Tessa up from school, and he was in the lumber aisle doing arithmetic in his head how many additional 2x6s for the east wall reinforcement at what cost, against what remained of the contract's materials budget, when he turned the corner toward the register and stopped. There was a magazine rack beside the register, the kind with the wire display and the rotating stand stocked with local and regional publications for people to look at while they waited in line. He had walked past it 100 times. He saw her face before he understood what he was seeing. It was a business journal, one of the regional quarterlies, the kind that ran profiles of company founders and industry leaders. Her photograph was on the lower half of the cover. Not the main story, but prominent. Dark hair, the direct look, he recognized. A single line of text beneath the photo credit that read, "Maren Bellamy, CEO, Laurel and Rook, Living. Building a brand on permanence." He stood there for a long moment. Then he picked it up. The profile was 4 pages. He didn't read all of it. He read enough the founding of Laurel and Rook Living 12 years ago, the expansion into commercial contracts, the revenue figures cited in carefully vague but clearly enormous terms, the description of her Burlington headquarters, the quote about her design philosophy that used the exact same word she had used with him, once sitting on the railing at the waterfront, talking about the community center chairs he was building. Permanence, she had said. Things should be made to last. He had thought she was talking about furniture. Later, when he had more distance on it, he would remember that Brenna had been standing outside the store that afternoon, finishing a phone call. He had walked past her without registering who she was. He had heard two words clearly before the sliding door closed behind him: the profile and Maren. He hadn't understood what they meant at the time. He understood now. Brenna hadn't planned it, but she hadn't hung up the call either. Some truths, it turned out, find their own way out. He set the magazine back in the rack. He paid for his lumber. He drove to Tessa's school and sat in the pickup line and watched the other cars and felt the specific quality of a thing rearranging itself inside him. Not shattering, not yet, but shifting. The way weight moves when you realize you've been standing on something that wasn't solid ground. Tessa came out in her orange coat and climbed into the back seat and told him that her friend had brought a salamander to school in a jar, and the teacher had not been ready for that. And he listened and responded and drove home, and the whole time the magazine cover sat in the back of his mind like a door he wasn't ready to open. He opened it that night after Tessa was in bed. He sat at the kitchen table with his phone and looked up Laurel and Rook Living, and the website was exactly what the profile had suggested. Clean, expensive, the kind of design that communicated money without having to say so. He found her name in the leadership section, her biography, a photograph that was professionally lit in a way that none of her photos with him had been. He looked at it for a while. Then he put the phone down and looked at the pale yellow kitchen walls and thought about $28 and a green canvas jacket, and the way she had looked at his backyard bench through the kitchen window, and how all of it felt now like a set. The worst part, the part that sat in his chest like something caught, was that none of it had felt like a set. That was the part he couldn't reconcile. She had been present in a way that didn't feel constructed. She had been awkward in ways that no one would plan. She had eaten 2 bowls of her own under-seasoned soup and looked genuinely surprised that it was edible. But she had also looked him in the eyes and let him believe something that wasn't true. And he didn't know how to hold both of those things at the same time. He stopped returning her messages. Not dramatically, no explanation, no confrontation. He just let the responses get slower, then stopped. The call she tried on Tuesday he declined. The one on Wednesday he let go to voicemail and did not listen to for 2 days. He told himself it was because he needed to think. That was partly true. The other part was that Tessa had started drawing Maren. Not constantly, not obsessively, but in the casual way that 6-year-olds incorporate people into their visual world. A figure with dark hair appearing in the margins of school drawings, at the edges of cloud diagrams, standing beside the truck in a rendering of Nora's toast wagon that Tessa had taped to the inside of her bedroom door. He had noticed it the night he declined Maren's call, standing in the doorway while Tessa slept, and the drawing had made something tighten in his throat that had nothing to do with anger. He was angry. He was also something else. Something that didn't have as clean a name, and the combination of the two made it easier to stay silent than to speak. Maren found him at the workshop on a Friday. She did not arrive in the green canvas jacket. She came in a charcoal blazer and dark slacks, her work clothes, as if she had driven straight from the office and not stopped to change, which she had, because changing would have been a kind of management, and she had decided somewhere on the drive over that she was done managing this. The workshop door was open. Nolan was at the bench, running a hand plane along the edge of an oak slat, and he heard her before he saw her, her footsteps on the gravel outside, and he straightened but didn't turn around immediately. And when he did,
His face was the face of a man who had already had the conversation in his head many times and was not surprised that it was finally happening out loud.
"I'm not here to explain it away," Maren said. She stood just inside the doorway. "I'm not going to tell you it was complicated or that my reasons made sense, because I've thought about it enough to know they weren't good enough. I was scared. That's the actual answer. I was scared that if you knew, you'd see the title before you saw me, and I would become—" She stopped, chose a different angle. "I've had people look at me and calculate, and I'd gotten very good at knowing when it was happening. And I wanted, just once, for it not to be a factor. I thought I could just remove it from the equation." Nolan set the hand plane down on the bench. He didn't cross his arms. He just stood there, and the lamplight in the workshop made the sawdust in the air look like it was suspended in amber. "You didn't remove it," he said. "You hid it. There's a difference." His voice was even, not cold, something more controlled than cold. "You didn't just hide the money, you hid the power. And you let me stand next to you thinking we were on equal ground, when that was never actually true. You had information I didn't have. That changes the shape of everything we said to each other. I know. I told you things." He stopped, started again. "I opened up to you, about Tessa, about—" He didn't finish the sentence, but they both knew what the unfinished part was. "I did that because I thought I understood who I was talking to." "The things I told you were true," Maren said. "Everything I said about what I wanted and what I was tired of and why I was there, that was real. I know that doesn't fix it." "No," he agreed. "It doesn't." The workshop was quiet, except for the faint sound of traffic from the street outside. "Tessa's drawn you," he said finally, "on her bedroom door. She hasn't asked me directly about why you've been gone, but she's been building up to it for a week." He looked at Maren directly. "I need you to understand that when you made this choice, it wasn't just my trust you were taking a risk with." Maren held his gaze and did not look away, and did not offer him anything that resembled an excuse. "I understand," she said. She understood something else by then, too. Something she hadn't fully seen until Brenna called her on a Tuesday afternoon, and said in a tone that had shed its usual professional neutrality entirely, "Silas is moving." Silas Trent had been on the Laurel and Rook board for 9 years, and in that time, he had developed a precise understanding of what the brand needed to survive quarters when the numbers didn't cooperate. The previous quarter had not cooperated. The projections for the current one were not reassuring. The shareholders who had been patient were becoming the other kind, and Silas was the sort of man who believed that every problem had a story that could solve it. If you found the right story, fast enough. He had found one. He brought it to Maren in a meeting that had been scheduled as a routine strategic review and revealed itself within the first 10 minutes to be something else entirely. He had done his research. Maren's dating profile had not been as anonymous as she'd assumed, and within a company of their size, personal information moved through the informal channels faster than any policy could contain it. He knew about Nolan. He knew about the community center contract. He had a mock-up of the campaign concept already prepared, printed on good paper, slid across the table with the confidence of a man presenting an idea he considered generous. Laurel and Rook Gives Back, a story of community. A profile piece, a photo spread. The female CEO and the single father building something together in a neighborhood that needed it. Human warmth for a brand that the focus groups had been calling for 2 quarters aspirational but cold. Silas framed it carefully. He was not presenting it as exploitation. He was presenting it as alignment. A real story, he said, authentic material, the kind of thing you couldn't manufacture. "Because it involves a real person," Maren said, "who hasn't consented to any of this. We'd approach him, of course. He won't agree." Silas smiled in the way that suggested he had already considered this and found it surmountable.
People's positions on these things often shift when, no. She said it before he could finish, flat and final. This isn't a direction we're taking.
The meeting ended. The idea did not. Within a week, the outline of the campaign had circulated informally among 3 other board members, 2 of whom thought it had merit, one of whom told Silas to move carefully, but didn't tell him to stop. Brenna heard it from an assistant down the hall and told Maren within the hour. And by the time Maren processed the full shape of it, the timeline, the people involved, how far it had already traveled, she felt something shift in her that had nothing to do with strategy and everything to do with a man standing in a workshop, telling her he had told her things, and the particular weight of that sentence. Nolan found out the way you find out things you were already half afraid of, sideways, in a conversation he hadn't been meant to hear. He was at the community center site on a Thursday morning when the structural engineer delivered the findings from the inspection. 2 of the main load-bearing partition walls had been compromised by decades of moisture damage, far more extensive than the original survey had indicated. The repair was not optional. It was not minor, and the cost of addressing it correctly was nearly double what remained of the materials budget. Without additional funding, the project would be halted within the week. By Friday afternoon, a representative from Laurel and Rook Living had made contact with the city liaison overseeing the contract, offering to cover the funding gap. The offer came with conditions attached: a media component, a human interest angle, a photograph of the partnership. The city liaison, who wanted the building finished before the weather turned and had very little patience for complications, called Nolan to relay the offer with the tone of someone presenting a simple solution to a simple problem. Nolan listened to the entire thing without interrupting. Then, he said no. The liaison tried 3 more sentences. Nolan said no to each of them, hung up, and stood in the unfinished community center room with exposed wall studs and the smell of old plaster and the specific feeling of a man who has just watched 2 separate bad situations merge into one larger one. His crew had families. The community center had a waiting list of kids and seniors who had been told it would open before December. He had built his reputation in this neighborhood on doing what he said he would do. And somewhere on the other side of the city, a brand that belonged to a woman he had trusted was preparing to use all of it as a backdrop for a photo spread. That evening, Tessa found him sitting at the kitchen table, not doing anything in particular, which she recognized as a state that required management. She climbed into the chair across from him with the seriousness of a very small person who has decided to take a meeting. She had her cloud notebook under one arm, and she set it on the table in front of her, the way adults set folders in meetings, and she looked at him directly. "Is Maren in trouble?" she asked. He looked at his daughter. "Why do you ask that?" Tessa arranged her hands on the table. "Because she stopped coming. And when people stop coming, it's usually because something bad happened to them, or because they think they did something wrong." She considered. "Which one is it?" Nolan opened his mouth and closed it again. "Both," he finally said. "Sort of." Tessa nodded slowly, as if this confirmed a theory she'd been developing for days. "Is it the kind of wrong that's fixable?" He didn't have an answer for that. He sat with the question for the rest of the night. The question Tessa had asked, "Is it the kind of wrong that's fixable?" stayed with Nolan, the way certain questions do, not loudly, but persistently, the way a loose board announces itself every time you step on it in the dark. He didn't have an answer, but he noticed that he was still looking for one, and that seemed like information. 3 days after Tessa's question, Brenna showed up at Maren's apartment at 7 in the morning without calling ahead. Maren opened the door, still holding her coffee. Brenna walked past her into the kitchen, turned around and said, "You have until end of day to decide what you're doing. After that, Silas has enough board support to move the campaign forward with or without your sign-off, and you know it." Maren set her coffee down. "I know," she said. "Then I need you to hear something." Brenna had the look of a person who had rehearsed this in the car and was delivering it anyway, despite the rehearsal feeling insufficient.
You can keep managing this. You're very good at managing things. You can find a compromise that satisfies the board and protects the brand and keeps everything at arm's length, and you will be fine. The company will be fine. She met Maren's eyes. But you will have done it by letting Silas use Nolan.
And you will know that. Every time you look at whatever you and Nolan become, or don't become, you will know what you chose when it cost you something.
The kitchen was very quiet. You've been my assistant for 4 years, Maren said carefully. I know. You have never once talked to me like this. Brenna didn't look away. I know that too. A beat. I'm not sure I've always done you any favors by not doing it sooner. Maren stood there for a long moment looking at nothing in particular, and then she picked up her coffee, looked at it, and set it back down without drinking.
I need to make a call, she said. Can you get me a conference room by 8? Brenna was already reaching for her phone. Maren walked into the Laurel and Rook boardroom that morning, having made a decision the night before that she had not fully talked herself out of, which she took as a sign that it was probably the right one. Silas was already seated when she arrived, as he always was, and the 4 other board members arranged themselves around the table, with the careful neutrality of people who had been briefed by at least 2 different sides and were waiting to see which way the room went. Maren set her folder on the table and did not open it. I want to address the Greer proposal directly, she said, because I think leaving it in the informal channel has allowed it to gain more traction than it deserves. She looked at Silas, not with hostility, but without the diplomatic softening she usually applied. The answer is no, a clean no, not a deferred no. Laurel and Rook will not be using Nolan Greer's image, his project, his family, or his story in any marketing capacity, this quarter, next quarter, or as part of any future campaign. That's not a negotiating position. It's a decision. Silas set his pen down with the controlled deliberateness of a man exercising patience. Maren, the numbers from last quarter. I've read the numbers. Then you understand that the board has a responsibility to the shareholders to pursue viable.
I understand that we're looking for a story, Maren said. I understand that the focus groups called us cold, and that cold doesn't move product the way warm does, and that someone looked at my personal life and saw a solution to a branding problem. She kept her voice level, not because she wasn't angry, but because anger in that room would be read as emotion, and emotion would be read as weakness. And she needed them to hear the argument, not discount the messenger. But this company does not get to reach into someone's private life and extract material because the quarterly numbers are uncomfortable. That is not what we are. And if the board disagrees with me on that, then I need to know, because it changes what I'm willing to do in this chair. The room was quiet. Silas looked at her with the expression of a man recalculating. He was not, she knew, a cruel person. He was a person for whom the distance between a good story and a person's dignity had simply never registered as a meaningful distance. That was, in some ways, harder to argue with than cruelty. You're asking us to walk away from an opportunity, he said, to protect the feelings of someone who isn't in this room and has no stake in this company. I'm asking you to remember that having no stake in this company is exactly why we have no right to use him. She looked around the table. Laurel and Rook will fund the community center project, anonymously. No media component, no photo documentation, no press release. The money goes to the project and the project gets finished, and we don't attach our name to it. Because that's what it looks like when you do something because it's right, instead of because it's useful. Silas looked at the other board members. 2 of them did not look back at him. This will be reflected in the quarterly report, he said finally. It was not agreement. It was a retreat to the next line of defense. I know, she said. I'll handle the report. She closed the folder she had never opened and left the room before anyone could reshape the ending. She drove to the community center that afternoon and delivered the anonymous funding agreement to the city liaison in person. She had written it so that no one needed to ask questions about the source. Nolan was there. He was on the second floor with two members of his crew, and he heard her voice downstairs and came down.
Maren was standing in what would eventually be the main gathering room, wide ceilings, new windows that hadn't been painted around yet, and she held out an envelope without preamble.
"This is a copy of the agreement," she said. "The funding is anonymous. There's no media component, no conditions, no Laurel and Rook name anywhere in the documentation." She kept her arm extended. "You don't have to thank me. You don't have to say anything. You can take it as a community grant from a source that chose not to be identified, and we never have to talk about it again." Nolan looked at the envelope, then at her. "You killed the campaign," he said. "Yes." "Silas agreed to that?"
Silas disagreed extensively. The funding still went through. She lowered her arm. "I told the board that if they wanted to use someone's private life as a branding tool, they'd need to find a CEO who was comfortable with that. They weren't ready to make that trade this quarter." He was watching her with the careful attention she had come to recognize. The look that meant he was not just hearing the words, but measuring the space around them.
"This could cost you," he said. "The board position." It could. She didn't offer it as sacrifice or as proof of anything. She said it the way you state a weather condition, present real, neither welcomed nor refused. That's a separate problem. It doesn't change whether this was the right thing to do. Nolan took the envelope. He didn't open it. He just held it and looked at the room around them. The new walls, the unfinished floor, the future shape of the place. And something in his posture shifted in a way that wasn't resolution exactly, but was adjacent to it. "There's a lot of work still to do," he said. "The floor needs sanding. The back room needs 2 more coats. My crew is working through the weekend." Maren understood what he was not quite saying. "I have weekend clothes in my car."
"You keep extra clothes in your car?"
"I've been keeping them in my car for a week," she said. "In case." Something moved across his face, not a smile, not yet, but the precondition for one. "The sanding's the worst part," he said. "It gets into everything." "I know," she said. "I'll manage."
She did not manage gracefully. She managed the way someone manages who has spent 15 years in offices and conference rooms. Which is to say, badly, with determination and without complaint.
She sanded the wrong section twice. She applied primer to the back room in strokes that Nolan's crew member Dale, who had been doing this for 20 years, regarded with diplomatic silence before gently redirecting her. She moved supply bags from one end of the building to the other whenever anyone needed them, and made coffee runs at 10 in the morning and again at 3 in the afternoon. And swept sawdust off the new floor with the focused attention of someone who had decided that this particular task was within her competence and was going to be done correctly. Nobody from Laurel and Rook came by. Brenna knew where she was and had not called. There were no photographs taken. She was wearing the green canvas jacket. Not as a statement, she hadn't thought about it that way when she'd pulled it from the back of her car. But it was the jacket she'd worn on every walk they'd taken together, on every Friday night at the truck. On the first evening she'd sat in Nolan's kitchen and looked out at his backyard bench. It was the jacket she'd worn when she was trying to be just herself and not anything else.
Tessa arrived on Saturday afternoon, delivered by a neighbor's car, and stood in the doorway of the main room in her orange coat with a drawing rolled up under one arm, looking at the space with the evaluative expression she brought to most new environments. Maren was on her knees at the far end of the room, working on a low section of baseboard that had been missed in the first coat. She had a streak of off-white paint on her left forearm, and her hair had given up on its original arrangement entirely. She looked up and saw Tessa, and didn't immediately stand. She stayed where she was, brush in hand, waiting to see what would happen. Tessa walked the length of the room slowly, looking at the walls, the windows, the new light fixture overhead that wasn't connected yet. Then she stopped in front of Maren
and studied the paint streak on her arm with the seriousness of a doctor reviewing a chart. "You have paint on you," Tessa observed. "I know. Dad gets paint on him too. He says it means you're working hard enough." Maren looked at the streak. "I hope so."
Tessa considered this satisfactory. She sat down cross-legged on the drop cloth beside Maren and unrolled the drawing she'd brought a corner of the room she'd apparently planned out in advance, labeled in large, uneven letters, "The Cloud Corner." There were bookshelves in the drawing, and a window with curtains, and a small rug with a circular pattern, and along the top of the wall where a border might go, a row of clouds, each labeled with its category in handwriting that was still learning how to be handwriting. "It's for the reading part," Tessa said. "I thought the kids who come here could name their own clouds. I can teach them." Maren looked at the drawing for a long time. "This is really good, Tessa," she said. And then, because she meant it specifically and thought Tessa deserved to know what she meant, "The clouds on the border were my favorite part." Tessa accepted this. "I know," she said, without vanity, as a simple confirmation. "Can I help with the painting?" "Ask your dad." Tessa was already on her feet, moving toward the back room where Nolan was working. Maren listened to her footsteps cross the floor, and then Tessa's voice carrying through the unfinished walls. And then Nolan's response, low, warm, the tone of a man talking to the person he had built everything around. And she turned back to the baseboard and put the brush back to the wall, and felt something settle in her chest that she didn't try to name. Later, much later, after the second coat was done and the crew had packed up and Tessa had fallen asleep on a folded drop cloth in the corner, with her drawing tucked under her head like a pillow, Nolan found Maren sitting on the floor of the main room with her back against the newly painted wall, looking at the window and the dark outside it, and the reflection of the work light in the glass. He sat down beside her, not close enough to presume anything, just beside her in the way that people sit beside each other when proximity itself is the statement. They didn't speak for a while. The building had the particular quiet of a space that was almost finished, not empty, not full, but on the threshold of becoming what it was supposed to be. "She's going to sleep well," Nolan said, meaning Tessa. "She earned it. She painted 12 linear feet of baseboard." "I saw." He looked at the wall across from them, freshly white, still carrying the faint smell of primer. "She told me the cloud corner was your favorite part of her drawing." "It was." Nolan nodded slowly. "She doesn't give that kind of approval easily." Maren looked at her hands, still faintly marked with paint. "I know. That's why it matters." The light shifted slightly as a car moved past outside, then settled back. "I'm not there yet," Nolan said. He said it plainly, without armor. "I want to be honest with you about that. What happened, I still feel it. It's going to take time." "I know," Maren said. "I'm not asking you to be there yet. What are you asking?" She thought about it genuinely, the way his directness had always made her think genuinely. "I'm asking for the chance to be someone you can trust. Not immediately. Over time. By actually being that person, not by telling you I am." She looked at him. "That's all." Nolan held that for a moment. "Okay," he said. Not as forgiveness. As a door opened a measured amount. Possible was enough. Possible was what he had. The community center opened on a Saturday in late November, with folding chairs set up in the main room and a table of donated food by the entrance, and kids running through the hallways with the chaotic joy of children who have discovered a new space and are testing its acoustics. There was no press. There was no signage from Laurel and Rook. The only decoration in the main room that had not been there before was a framed drawing. Hung at child height on the wall of a small reading nook, a row of clouds, each labeled, floating above 3 figures standing in front of a familiar food truck. The lake behind them, the sky, full of white. At the bottom, in the careful, uneven handwriting of a 6-year-old who had recently upgraded her letter sizing, one word.
Home. The Friday after the opening, Nolan brought Maren back to Nora's toast wagon. It was cold enough now that Nora had pulled the awning down and set up a small propane heater near the window, and the Edison bulbs reflected in the dark surface of the lake like something deliberate. They sat at the same table with the railing behind them, and the same paper cups of soup, and Nora, who had been watching this situation develop for 2 months, with the patience of a woman who had seen a great many situations, said nothing and handed them their orders and went back to her griddle. Nolan reached into his jacket pocket and set something on the table between them. A key. Small, plain, the kind cut at a hardware counter. Not new, it had the worn look of something used. "That's the workshop," he said. "Not the house. Not yet." He looked at it on the table rather than at her. "But it's the place where I make things that I want to last. And if you want, you can start there." Maren looked at the key for a long moment. When she picked it up, her hand was not entirely steady. She didn't say anything because he hadn't asked her to say anything, and because some things are answered more clearly by the hand than by the voice. Across the table, Nolan watched her, and for the first time in longer than he could precisely remember, the door that had been open a measured amount opened a little more. Not all the way, but enough. What stayed with me about this story isn't the moment Nolan handed Maren the key. It's the moment before that, when he chose not to perform generosity at the gilded hearth. Not to make a show of it, just to say, "I know a better place." That kind of quiet decency doesn't ask for an audience. And neither did Maren, in the end, when she showed up to sand floors and carry coffee with paint on her jacket and no camera in sight. We don't always get to choose the circumstances we're tested in, but we do get to choose what we do in them, whether we reach for the impressive gesture or the honest one. If this story meant something to you, subscribe and stick around. There's a lot more where this came from. Stories about the small choices that turn out to matter most. We'd love to have you here.